So the bear activity at Brooks River changes over days, seasons, and certainly years. Really, what does that mean for park managers who are tasked to protect this population of brown bears here at Brooks River and Katmai National Park? My name is Mike Fitz with explore.org, and today we're going to talk about the bear monitoring program here at Brooks River, which is a unique and actually I find to be a fascinating program to help park biologists and managers understand the changes of our bear population here over time. And to help me explore that topic is actually Katmai's wildlife biologist, Leslie Skora. So Leslie, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, so we do a chat like this, I think, every year. Mm-hmm. So it's a great opportunity to learn more about the bear monitoring program itself. Personally, I can say I have found the bear monitoring program to be extremely insightful. It was one of those things that when I first started working here, just going back and looking through the data, even kind of casually, as a ranger here, I found that it was recording so much fascinating information about the individual bears and documenting these long-term trends over time, that it actually kind of inspired me to draft some of the original versions of the Bear ID book and try to interpret the individual lives of these bears that we have on the river. So I think the monitoring data is extremely important, not only from a management perspective, which we'll get into in a little bit, but also I think just from a bear viewing perspective, when you want to enjoy the brown bears here at Brooks River. So I'm really thankful for your work and past bear monitors in the past. And we'll dive into this topic of the bear monitoring program, get into the nitty-gritty details of how you do it in just a little bit. But before I get to the questions I have for Leslie, if you do have questions for Leslie, please drop those into the chat on explore.org. The helpful moderators from Explore will be looking for those, and they will send them to us. So I'll be glancing at my device here from time to time to see if any questions happen to come in. We'll try to get to those as best we can. There probably will be too many. There always is for this chat, but we'll try to get to them as best we can as we're working our way through. Leslie, actually, one thing that I probably should start out with before, and I didn't include this in the outline, but this will be an easy one for you to answer. Is you can give us a little bit of an idea of your background. How long have you been working at Katmai, and how did you get interested in brown bears?
Sure. So I started at Katmai in 2013, and I was the bear monitor, so I was hired as a seasonal employee to continue this data collection that was going on at Brooks Camp, and have been doing that since, well, I guess up until 2 years ago, or about a year and a half ago, when I sort of passed the torch on to another official bear monitor, and then I became the wildlife biologist here. So now I've had to take a step back from being in the field all the time and getting to spend hours watching the bears, but now what's continuing to pique my interest is playing with the data and looking at the numbers and how can we use this information for a variety of different topics for both management and tracking abundance of the bears through time. So yeah, it's been me learning what I can use this data for, learning what the project has been in its history, and now I'm taking it even a step farther, although it means more office time, but it's all right.
Yeah, sometimes I think people get real excited about the field work initially. You're like, oh, I'm going to be out, I'm going to be looking at bears all the time. But then it really, the science part of it comes in when you can actually look at the data and see what it tells you. But let's actually start with the field work itself, and you'll probably be able to hear a couple of bears in the background from us. And that's one of those fascinating things about being at Brooks River here. We can talk about bears, and it's just not just in the abstract. They're right behind us. But can you tell us a little bit about the bear monitoring program itself, and how long has it been ongoing?
Sure. Yeah. So it started in the late 80s by a graduate student, and then it continued on for a few years, and then in the 90s it continued, but it was a little less consistent. But back once the early 2000s came along, so 2001, it's been continuing consistently ever since then. So we have a fairly long-term data set, and we can use different parts of that depending on the questions that we need answered. But yeah, pretty consistent since 2001 and onward, and so we're trying to keep that trend going.
And one of the questions that we often get on the bear cams is just exactly where are you monitoring bears from? You're not all along the river, but where are your different monitoring locations?
So we have 3 locations set up. There's the falls viewing platform, and then there's a spot a little bit farther downriver of the riffles platform, and it's basically just a tree stand, and that's looking at those bears mid-river that are kind of using below the riffles, and bears using the river potentially at a spot where there isn't a viewing platform. And then we'll do some monitoring from here at the lower river platform. So those 3 locations in the July season, and then in the fall monitoring season in September, we just use that lower river of the cut banks tree stand and here, just because the bears tend to be using the lower river more than the falls, although we've seen that kind of change a little bit through time.
Yeah, that's one of those changes that we have noticed, sort of, especially on the bear cams, is that bears are just starting to fish the falls fairly consistently in September and October, which is not something that had happened sort of historically here over like in the 80s and 90s. It's kind of like a new thing. So maybe that's a trend that we can observe on the bear cams. And I have some ideas about how you can contribute to a community science project that I'll get to a little bit later on. So stay tuned for that. But this is one of these spots where you're monitoring bears from. Actually, we're standing in the exact spot. There's a little sign right behind me here that says reserved for researchers. I like to stand in these spots because they actually, when the bear monitor isn't here, it's really kind of like the best spot to look. You can look upriver, you can look downriver. So if you were here during a monitoring scan at the lower river, can you kind of walk us through what you would do during your 10-minute scans? Because you're recording a lot of data during those 10-minute scans, but then every 10 minutes you're also recording like a subset of information during that time. So what happens during those scans that you're conducting?
Sure. So we have the river broken up into different zones. So here for the lower river, we have above the bridge is one zone and below the bridge is another zone. So at the beginning of a 10-minute scan, we'll have the monitor will start from upriver and do a consistent pattern scanning all the landscape that's within this zone. And we keep it consistent just so that if a bear appears after the monitor has already looked in that zone, we're not going to count it. It's supposed to be a snapshot in time of what we're capturing of bear behavior and numbers in each zone, as well as human presence in these areas. So we'll once again at the beginning of that scan record an individual bear, what its current activity is, and then later on we'll go back and try to identify that bear. But recording the activity sort of allows us to look at how they're spending their time. If it's a very active pulsive salmon are coming up and they're all being very successful, we'll see more bears recorded as eating a fish versus fishing or resting, and we can then look at different zones as to how bears spend time in those zones, and perhaps what differences we might see throughout the day of more resting during some periods versus actively fishing, and then potentially how things might change if there are people present on the river.
And I imagine right now the current bear monitor, Tammy, is probably had some fairly low-key sessions because we haven't had a lot of salmon moving into the river for the past several days, so that probably lowers the overall abundance of bears. But there's not, from my experience, there hasn't always been like a direct correlation between the number of fish and the number of bears. It seems to be really loose. Like a superabundance of fish means, sometimes fewer bears at the falls, especially because they get their fill and they're like, oh, I'm too full, I'm going to go into the forest. And then if there seems to be just enough, that's when you have like these massive amounts of bears, showing up, 20 bears, 30 bears sometimes within sight of the falls. So it really does vary from day to day considerably. And that's what makes, of course, bear watching fun. It's never kind of like the same thing. They're always teaching you different stuff. So you mentioned identifying individual bears. So how would you go about doing that? And that's one of the important, for like the webcam audience especially, I think one of the most valuable aspects of the bear monitoring program is we get to know these bears on an individual level. So if you're watching a brown bear, what are those characteristics in it that you look for to identify it?
Sure. So that is one of the unique aspects of this bear monitoring, is that we are able to identify a bear just based off of its physical and behavioral features. They're not tagged or numbered. So we'll look at coat color, shed patterns, just I guess differences in the facial profile, kind of the ear set as wide as opposed to narrow, or how they're positioned on top of their head. Scars can be good for a season, but these bears heal remarkably quickly, so I try not to be too reliant on scars, just because by the fall we may not be able to see it once a new coat kind of comes in. But the bears will typically, if they're seen in the spring with a lighter color coat, they'll tend to come back each year and have those similar characteristics of a light colored coat, or have similar shed patterns from year to year. We'll see often like a V-shaped shed pattern on her forehead that we'll note. And so yeah, each time we're looking at these bears, we're recording, gathering photos to keep records of what bears look like from year to year, and then writing these descriptions of where they're fishing, what different types of fishing techniques they use, and then yeah, the little minute details, sometimes facial profiles of specific little like muzzle bumps or a protruding nose or something like that. But all of those nitty-gritty little details are what we try to use, and then they come back in the fall and their faces are submerged the whole time, so all you can see are ears.
Yeah, they're completely different looking
Exactly.
in the fall. It actually is difficult to match up sometimes bears that visit here in July and some that visit here in the fall. So yeah, and the numbers sometimes and the identifications are it's not something that you can just like kind of throw out and say you're sure of all the time. Absolutely. You really do have to go through the data very carefully, look at the photographs very carefully, and it's really kind of in those late October, November is when you get your numbers, your overall numbers, and how many are visiting that room.
Exactly, yeah, and it is, you're right, it's not perfect because we are just looking at these physical features and they change so rapidly through time, and it's one of the drawbacks of perhaps not using tags. However, tags can fall off, so it's kind of one of those balances. But yeah, we try to go through things as thoroughly as possible and correct any mistakes that were made. But I'm sure with webcam viewers it's difficult to tell which bear is which, and it's the same for even the bear monitor, and so that kind of goes into when we number and how long it takes us to come up and confirm a bear number, just because it takes a while. We want to be as sure as possible, but really, yeah, nothing is ever 100% really.
So I think the lesson in that is use the gestalt of the bear, everything really, right?
Yes.
So coat color, scars, claw color if you can see it, their shed patterns, and then their behavior too. I mean, behavior is a really important point for a lot of these bears. Some of them have their like individual quirks, and you're like, oh yeah, that's him, because he's really the only one who does that. We know there's a little bit of plane noise right now, so hopefully you can still hear us. I think that'll clear up here in just a bit. But you mentioned bear numbers, so how do bears receive their numbers? How are you assigning those numbers to individual bears?
So we assign a 3-digit number to each bear that is considered a regular user while we're doing the monitoring sessions. So a bear has to be seen during 3 or more different sessions of the monitoring observations, and this just makes sure it's part of the definition of a regular user of Brooks River. So it's not just a bear that passes through one day, but it also allows us to confirm that we are able to identify this bear repeatedly, or at least more than just once or twice. So it has to be seen at least 3 times, and then we kind of put all of its identifying descriptors in a folder, and then usually by the end of the season we'll collect the different bears that have made it in all 3 or more scan, and then we'll assign a number. Those numbers we assign a different hundreds numbers each year. So this year we've made come full circle, and we'll be in the something numbers. So we're back to the 2-digit numbers, but it'll still be 3. There'll be a silent 0
in front of it.
Yes.
Okay, so technically I should be, instead of saying number 089. I should be saying 089 technically, but we won't get into the weeds that much. So we have this bear monitoring program. It's been going on for, as you mentioned, for a couple of decades in a consistent fashion right now. So how does that really help staff better manage the bears here and protect them over time?
So part of my research is looking how the total numbers that the monitoring has collected each season and each year of counts of individual bears has changed through time, and then looking at what factors might be influencing that as far as salmon escapement and river levels. But it's allowing us to look at those changes, and since we can identify those individual bears season after season, it serves as almost like a capture-recapture study. So instead of like collaring a bear with a radio collar and searching for that bear and making sure it's alive year after year, we can just kind of stand here and sort of have the bears come to us almost, but really it's just Brooks River. So it can conserve in that capacity, as well as to look at how bears use the different zones of the river differently. So with this monitoring, we're able to see how more dominant males use the falls area as opposed to sows with cubs and subadults that we see using this lower river. And in analyzing it in the future, we can look at perhaps lower level river level years, drawing out a greater number of bears using the lower river in July, whereas typically if there's more of a water column, the hypothesis being that the salmon are more able to escape, therefore we may not see as many bears using the lower river in July. So kind of all of these different aspects we can answer questions from the data, and sometimes questions come from the data, or we design the project to answer a question beforehand. But since we have this long-term data set now, we can use it for answering a variety of things as long as it's collected the same consistent manner.
And we did have there is a major change here at the mouth of Brooks River this year, and that is the new elevated walkways. So I know that you've sort of expanded a bit of your bear monitoring program in a sense, to look at bear use near the bridge and people use in this area. So can you explain that aspect of your work and what you're paying attention to as far as bear and human activity goes on the river?
Sure. So part of it is looking at how bear space use has changed through time, and from that we're trying to compare some previous studies using time-lapse photography of how different bears were in the same zones before this new bridge, and then we're continuing that. So now post new bridge, we'll see if bears in the area, how they're using it. Are there fewer, more? Are they farther away, closer? So we'll be able to look at space use. But then as far as some new data collection going on in person, we're looking at different age and sex groups in the bear population and their distances. So it's somebody out here with another monitoring clipboard recording bear distances, and if it's a subadult, if it's a male, female, or an adult, a sow with cubs, and every 20 minutes they'll do a scan similar to the previous bear monitoring scans, but instead they're recording distances instead of behavior. So with that, the hypothesis being, is our presence perhaps causing some bears to not want to be in this area, or are male bears, adult male bears, are they choosing not to come down here, and that may affect how we manage the river in the future. And then also looking at bears who are choosing to be close to the bridge, what human behaviors might be impacting them more. So for that, we're doing a focal follow of an individual bear and tallying their vigilance bouts. So how many times are they looking up at the bridge and keying in on it, and what human activities are going on during these time periods. So perhaps we can better inform visitors that quiet noises are much better for bears using the bridge. They're less keyed in on us and more able to just concentrate on using the food resource. So from this new data collection, that's sort of what we're hoping to look at, or human movements and what distances as far as like our vehicles crossing and that sort of thing. So hopefully from that we'll be able to better manage our human impact.
Yeah, so a lot of things to pay attention to.
Yes.
Overall, that seems like quite a bit for one person to keep track of while they are trying to do it. So it must be a little bit of a challenge.
It's in its pilot year, so
Okay.
there's still some kinks being worked out of the data collection. However, it's coming along, and I think it'll, in the end, hopefully serve its purpose, and maybe we'll be talking about it in 10 years to come as to still we'll be collecting this data.
And before we get to some viewer questions, I actually have a couple of fun questions for you. They've all been fun for me to ask, but maybe these will be more fun for you to answer. So one of the bears that I like to watch, just because I think he's really, really big. So I'm going to ask you, 747, is he just a really big bear, or is he really giant bear? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Really big versus giant bear. I'm gonna go with giant just because the consistency.
Confirmation, right?
Yeah,
You heard it
I
here
mean,
first.
if he was just a big bear, some years he might, change category, but I haven't seen a year where he's not really big since reaching adulthood. So I'm just gonna, giant has its own orbit, gravitational field, perhaps.
And I think we all have bears that we like to watch and follow their stories. 747 for me is one of those bears that I like to watch just because he is so big, so successful at fishing. Maybe the biggest bear that I've ever seen. But Leslie, kind of like a final question for you before we get to viewer questions. Which bears are you interested in watching this year, and why? Does a bear, is there one bear that particularly stands out to you that you want to follow its story farther?
Well, I have to say that I think that's one of the things that's changed as I've stepped back from actually doing the bear monitoring and kind of into the office of now. I like looking at it as, I think, like taking a step back and looking at it as more of a system. So instead of one bear, I'm looking at it more of, I like just watching the lower river for its differences and its use habits, as opposed to just one in particular. But I also just like, there's still those special bears that you've seen kind of grow up from a cub. So it's always interesting now, 503, how dominant is he going to get? So I still like watching the stories of kind of growing up and dominance and who comes back with cubs. So there's still that aspect, but I think I've kind of taken a little bit of a step back as opposed to not one individual bear, but I think all the bears. Which seems like a safe answer, but it's...
Yeah. What are you hiding from the public, Leslie? But yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, there are so many different stories that happen here, and I think like the whole is really important, just as much as the individuals that we like to watch along the river. So yeah, I'm fascinated to see what comes out of this data in the future. That long-term monitoring study again has been extremely valuable to me. I want to kind of invite everybody, before we get to your audience questions, to participate in a community science project that I set up for Brooks River here, because I know a lot of people over the years have been itching to sort of participate in helping to document bear use of Brooks River. So when you take a snapshot using the Explore.org snapshot tool, there's a little prompt at the bottom of your snapshot window that says, participate in a survey or Bear Cam Community Science Project. If you click on that, it takes you to a survey. You answer just a few simple questions. One was, is there a bear in your photo? 2, did you how many bears were there? And 3, did you see any other species, in your photo? And you're not required to identify individual bears, so certainly you don't have to worry about knowing it like Leslie does. You just need to know if there's a bear in your photo, and then that can help us to maybe better understand the presence and absence of bears along the river outside of the bear monitoring periods itself. Because Leslie was mentioning, it's kind of like July, and it's also like late summer and fall when you're monitoring. So you can't monitor 24/7 either. So this will help us, I think, over time, just get a better idea. And this is a preliminary year, so that we might have to tweak the program just a little bit in the future. But I invite everyone to sort of participate in that, and over time, I think we can get a really good sample size on, again, the presence and absence of bears here at Brooks River. So I invite everyone to participate in that. And at the end of the year, I'll download the data, and I'll be mining that to see what interesting tidbits I can get from it as well. So yeah, please look for that. And Leslie, I'd like to thank you before I forget for joining me on the chat today. We're going to try to get to some audience questions with the time remaining. I know that you have to be at somewhere fairly soon, so I won't keep you too long. I think in the queue here there were probably like 30 questions or something like that. We won't get to all of them, I think, but we'll do our best to try to get to as many as we can. Some of the questions were about individual bears, and you said you've taken a little bit of a step back from that, so we might not be able to answer questions about the identity of certain individual bears, but I think some of the questions that we'll get to, we can maybe talk about why we haven't seen a bear here this year. We can kind of speculate on those reasons and that sort of thing. Quick question. I can answer this one really easily. Any sightings of 410? No, not that I'm aware of.
Not that I'm aware of either. She's, I guess, one that I'm always like, will she come back?
I would have liked to see her come back this year because we know she would be over 30 years old this year. So we don't know, a bear that old that was so consistent in her habits here. If you're not familiar with number 410, she was thought to be a spring cub in 1989. I saw her one day last year. So that was her 30th summer here at Brooks River, and I really wanted to kind of see her come back this year, but we haven't seen her yet. So with a bear like that, I don't know if you agree, but you kind of have to assume that she might be deceased.
Right. Exactly. It is hard to say, but yeah, with the consistency that she showed in the past of basically most every single year and season we had been seeing her. But you never know. We'll keep our eyes out.
I mean, bears surprise us all the time, so I wouldn't, it wouldn't really surprise me all of a sudden if she just walked out of the forest here and laid down, below the platform or whatever,
like she 4 hours.
Yeah, like she tends to do. So keep your eyes out. If you see a bear that looks like 410, please let us know. We'd love to see it. One question, we saw a mother bear here with 3 cubs. A lot of people suspect it is number 273. The bear monitor, I don't think, has been able to confirm that yet, so that's a tentative ID. It could change later in the fall. But people were kind of wondering about that bear's former offspring, which was seen as an independent bear, number 809. I am unaware of any confirmed sightings of that bear this year. But he's a sub-adult male, so he's a juvenile male. What, since he's not here, what might that mean sort of about his life? Typically sub-adult males are that class of bear that they don't stick around their mother's home.
Right. Yeah. In other studies that have collared bears and track these bears' locations through time, they've shown us that sub-adult, in particular males, tend to be the largest dispersers through time, as opposed to some of the sub-adult females. But even it's just that sort of young age, they're finding their own way. So it's not uncommon that a sub-adult male would just kind of try a new spot and so might just be doing fine some other salmon stream and making it work out there.
Yeah, they tend to just wander kind of far and wide. We know that sometimes they'll come back to Brooks River. Like we see that with number 89, who was raised along Brooks River. Number 503 is another one. So sometimes they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna come back. But yeah, sometimes they just like get wanderlust or itchy feet or whatever it is, and they just keep on going. So I'm sure if my mother's watching this, I'm sure she can understand because I moved far away from Pennsylvania where I grew up. Given the changes of where we've been seeing, bears use the river and how we've been seeing bears use the river during the past couple of years, have you considered, adding additional monitoring sessions for like the falls, Brooks Falls in, late summer and autumn, or maybe doing more monitoring sessions in August?
It's come up each season of doing some more monitoring in August at the falls. And I would like to get sort of a baseline as to, is this something that's going to keep growing, or is it just perhaps an anomaly for this time period? Are we just getting a decent silver salmon run for a bit, or is it going to continue through time? But changing the monitoring protocol, since it has been going on for so long, is something we really want to do with caution in order to make each year comparable to previous years. So it might have to be something that's sort of separate, its own thing for a bit before we can incorporate it, or just to make sure that we can parse out two separate sets of data as far as comparing things from year to year. So it's not done yet, although the bear monitor last year was able to just do in her extra time some sort of baseline monitoring. So it's potential, but not yet.
Yeah, if you started monitoring at Brooks Falls in September, for example, you wouldn't really the data wouldn't include anything that you could compare to from year to year. So it'd be like starting back in 2001, for example. You just would have nothing prior to that to compare it to. So it would take time for us to understand maybe those long-term trends.
Yep.
Let's see. I did have a question. Let me see if I can find it again. Is the data that's collected and analyzed, published anywhere for people to currently look at, or are you looking to publish in the future?
So I am looking to publish some things in the future. Hopefully, this coming winter we'll have some looking at bear-on-bear survival along Brooks River, using the monitoring data as that capture-recapture, and then looking at abundance and of bears at Brooks River and how that's changed through time. So hopefully sometime in the year to come. But there have been some other studies that have already been published. Back in the 80s when this began, there were several papers that came out from the researcher who started the monitoring program. So that is available. There were some other projects that have gone on, like when the Falls platform was put in, they did a similar sort of analysis of looking at how bear behavior might be changing pre-platform and post-platform. So there are some of those published through times, but otherwise, it's kind of just been building the data to do more things with. So look to the future.
Yeah, and a lot of that, some of those published studies, if you want to read about those things that happened, or the data that was collected in the late 80s, early 90s, look for Tamara Olson, Olson. Some of those are freely available online. You can download the PDFs. And again, those are papers that I found insightful about bear use along Brooks River. Besides, we're going to try to get to a couple more questions. We're running a little over. We try to stick to a half hour with these chats, but there's always so many questions. We tend to run a little bit over. But have you ever considered, besides just having like a bear monitor, using like trail cameras or any other methods to capture the movements and activities of bears here?
So with the time-lapse photography for the bear behavior, that's using trail cams, but as far as the monitoring, that same collecting of data for that project, we just haven't been able to find a way to get the full expansive view and yet the detail that having somebody, the human eye, actually present for. So we haven't found a way to kind of take over for an actual person in this physical location. But those technologies are rapidly becoming a fantastic tool for research. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the future, as we're developing some new projects, if we start incorporating things like time-lapse photography, or finding ways that the wonderful resources of Explore.org and webcam viewers can do similar to your project that you had mentioned of helping us to count, to determine presence and absence and that sort of thing.
And the robots aren't going to take Leslie's job, I don't think, anytime soon. It really, right now, the technology isn't there. Nothing really beats a person with a pair of binoculars. But I know there's some researchers that it's called the Bear ID Project, and it's kind of like a cool project where they're looking on developing facial recognition technology for brown bears, because bears, that's one of those things when you're identifying bears, like their faces are very, very different from one another. So that would be really kind of fantastic, I think, if it gets to that point where you have cameras along the river that just kind of tracks the movement of brown bears. And the data would be, incredibly large, but it would be kind of fascinating.
Right, and then it could help us with those times when we aren't sure about a bear ID, and as we had talked previously of these subadult males that may disperse and go somewhere for 5 years but may come back, but maybe rather unrecognizable for a person who hasn't seen them for 5 years. But if some sort of facial recognition software could pull it out, then it could be very useful.
And one final question. I know you're not able to watch the cams all that much because you're here at Brooks River. We have limited internet connectivity. I actually can hardly ever watch the cams while I'm here at Brooks River because of that. But when you get to see some clips or video footage from the cams, do you find it easier to identify bears through the webcams, or do you think it's easier when you're standing at the river? Because when you're here, for me, you see all those details, and sometimes there's so many details that things get lost. The cams sometimes kind of wash out a lot of those details.
Right.
So I think there's advantages to both, but I'm wondering if you have an opinion on which one might be easier.
Right. The cams are great because it's throughout the day, and so you don't have to actually either be outside or travel somewhere. And you can
eat cookies while you're
Exactly.
watching the cams. We can't do that here.
And you can see all the locations at once, basically. But from what I've been able to see, it's still for me easier to be in person and to see them and just be able to focus on one particular aspect that. And to be able to identify a bear is pretty unique to each person. Like, you may find that you can identify 273 based off of her ear shape, whereas I look at the kind of goatee pattern that she has, or some other feature. So I just find it my ability to actually kind of look and wait for a profile to turn. It's easier when it's kind of on my timing and terms, and I can zoom in or look away. So I guess there's that aspect, but yeah, there's it's a balance, I think.
Yeah, so I'm actually consistently impressed with the identifying abilities of some of our long-term cam viewers.
Absolutely.
So, it's actually gotten to the point, I haven't admitted this to them yet, I'm going to do it right now, but if I'm unsure about a bear, sometimes I'll go into the bear cam comments and see if there's consensus. And I will buck the trend. I am not shy about bucking the trend when I am confident in that. But sometimes people are really good at it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, maybe they have a point, and maybe I should reconsider who I'm thinking that bear is.
And it's always good to feel either confirmed in a hunch, because it'll take a while, and sometimes I just have these hunches of like, it kind of feels like this, but I'm not 100% sure. So it's great. Even rangers reach out to each other, and the bear monitor will reach out to me and other people as to, hey, what do you think about this? And so yeah, it's good to get some confirmation.
Yeah, we do that all the time. We're like, hey, did you see this bear? Who do you think it might be? That sort of thing. But Leslie, yeah, I would like to thank you for joining me on the chat today. Very insightful. Again, learning great stuff about the bear monitoring program. It's been again wonderful for me to look at that data over the years and share it with the audience all over the world. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And again, my name is Mike Fitz with Explore.org. We'll be back online soon to talk more about brown bears and salmon here at Brooks River. Thanks for joining us today.